Alright guys, what is up? It is the season of tryharding here for me because, as I mentioned off the balanced patch notes, we're not going to be doing like a crazy amount of like experimentation, like concept deck builds, just because there's not a lot to mess around with that can exist on even like a vaguely competitive level. But because of that, we're basically going to be optimizing high tier decks, and what that means is the meta list is going to be potentially a bit altered because of that. So let me go ahead and honestly get right into it. So this is the Meta Mondays for the week of June 30th. And we can see here a fairly consolidated meta. In terms of the effective win rates, there are about 4 decks that are able to have like tier 1 win rates, but I think a lot of them are going to have to stand the test of time first. And until then, right now, the highest win rate decks by far are Heimer Vi and my version of Kinko Elusives, which I'm actually quite proud of. I played Kinko Elusives. Actually, I played over 100 games of Kinko Elusives in the past 3 or 4 days. 4 days, I guess, at this point. And this is that we actually climbed to #1 Masters with. Currently, at time of recording, we are sitting at #1 on the Masters NA ladder, and I'm going to be grinding up tomorrow, and like as we play more, I'm going to be playing on my kind of like EU account. We get #1 with that as well. So basically, there's going to be more of like kind of like my takes on some of the higher tier lists because of that. And yeah, overall, we see a pretty consolidated tier 1. Currently, 2 decks in tier 1. There's a good chance it'll go to like a 3rd deck next week. We'll have to see. Probably the single marker with this current metagame is that it is extremely fast right now. This is probably the single fastest meta Runeterra has ever seen, which is to say most decks are trying to close out the game very early, and even decks like Heimer Vi that probably don't seem like very fast decks, if you aren't able to win the game by turn like 6 or 7 against Heimer Vi, and if they have drawn their Heimer, most matchups have just already completely lost, right? So basically, every deck is trying to race each other or trying to race down Heimer Vi, and decks just aren't really playing for too much late game opportunity, right? And for that, we'll see a lot of these like Shadow Isles decks, mostly deep and stuff, is like almost tier 3, basically in terms of win rates, with the biggest exception being Braumanivia, which is the highest performing slow deck. But apart from that, everything is very, very, very fast, so play fast or get left behind. So why is the meta so fast right now? Well, for the most part, a couple of the nerfs that came in mostly on stuff like They Who Endure basically just leaves Heimer Vi as uncontested as it's ever been as a deck. And Heimer Vi is kind of the pace setter of the meta. If you're not able to rush down Heimer Vi, unless you have an incredibly specific deck that might be able to take them into the late game, you will basically just lose. It's pretty much that simple. Now, despite that, there are actually a couple of somewhat new concepts, as we will get into later. Stuff like Braumanivia and different forms of like Basilisk Writer is definitely like kind of like showing itself. People are making different attempts on Basilisk Writer. I do think that an optimal version of Basilisk Writer will probably end up being tier 2, but not like, amazing in terms of the competitive format. We'll have to see. All right, anyway, that's enough dicking around. Let's get into the win rates here and the actual like meta evaluation for this week's tier list. So starting at the top of our list, we've got Heimer Vi. This comes in at probably the highest win rate version with 2 Solitary Monks and 1 Static Shock. There are a couple of minorly different versions of Heimer Vi. You can run like 2 claws. Some people are running 1. I was running 1 last week. But, it's just like a couple of very, very minor tweaks here and there. Ultimately, a fairly solved deck. This deck comes in at overall roughly a 58% win rate, which is not actually the highest win rate in terms of stats, but it is one of the harder decks to play and still overall going to be the best deck in the game if played at a fairly good level. The biggest problem with people playing this deck is a lot of them are kind of like either taking the mulligan wrong or mostly like not able to protect their Heimer. Like they're trying to play like a little too fast or a little aggressively, not banking mana properly. Overall, the biggest thing is like the #1 thing with this list is you always need to be banking 3 mana starting like turn 4 pretty much. And the simple difference of doing that or not will make a huge difference in terms of win rate. And that's kind of the biggest reason this deck does have a slightly below par win rate, and you can see that from the difference of the win rate on normal ladder with this deck to the win rate on Masters. There's not too much more to say about Heimer Vi. It's pretty simple. You know, turn 5, you vomit a Heimer, like double flash, you know, whatever you've got in your hand. And yeah, it's a fairly solved deck. There's really nothing going on here, right? There's not really modifications. Some people are on 2 Static Shock, but in terms of the deck build, this is just like strikingly linear and extremely rigid. And yeah, it's kind of like the meta king for a reason there. And there's a reason a lot of people are like saying it probably should have been nerfed, and I would pretty much say I'm in the camp as well. So, Heimer Vi in a nutshell. Then we've got Kinko Elusives. Now this is the version of Kinko Elusives. It took me 2 days to get from Plat to #1 Masters with this deck, and I was modifying it along the way, so I can't say it was card for guard the deck that I used at the very end, but this is the most optimal version for the current meta. Now this is actually a very different Kinko list from, you'll have noticed, I mean, you might have watched my video about, I think I made a video like 4 great decks for this meta. That was like 5 days ago, and this deck is very different from that. We are currently, I think, 9 cards different from that, and that's a pretty crazy amount. Now, the biggest reason for that is because, yeah, I mean, right now we're in, basically tryhard mode. I'm optimizing high-powered decks instead of trying to, like, you know, branch out and do, like, more original things. But, of course, there's still a lot in terms of optimizing these decks, and this is, I would say, much more powerful than the previous version. Now, I'm going to make a full guide for this. It's actually going to be out tomorrow. Apologies for the delay. It was supposed to come out yesterday, believe it or not. At least we got Meta Mondays on time, though, right? But basically, the logic here is this is one of the fastest metas we've ever seen in Legends of Runeterra, and because it actually, as I mentioned, it is the fastest meta. So Keeper of Masks is going to be kind of necessary. It can stave off the aggro and it can race people down. We don't want to be running Jeweled Protector or Kinko Lifeblade. Those cards are going to be too slow for what this meta wants to do. You want to be able to either race opponents down or potentially stop them from rushing you down. And those cards like, Jeweled Protector and Kinko Lifeblade end up just being a little too slow and clunky. Instead, we've got not only Keeper of Masks, but Concussive Palm as well, which is going to be kind of like a nice way to stall out kind of early game spots against aggro. It's a fairly flexible card as well. Then we've got the 3rd Zed. We were on the 2Z version for a little bit. A lot of that was just because like the stats were supporting 2Z, and 2Z is a nice budget thing, but overall I think especially in this meta, you do have to be on the 3rd Zed. It's just, you know, I mean, if you're a budget player, it's not like the highest single priority for a champ craft, but the deck definitely does want to be on a 3rd Zed. Oh yeah, I should also mention this deck has an absolutely obscene 63% win rate for this version of the list with the Keeper of Masks. So yeah, this is a really good deck. Elusives are very in right now. It is unfavored against Heimer Vi slightly, although this version actually puts them on a bit of a clock. If their draw isn't great, you can often just kind of like power them down with your early aggression, which is super important. So yeah, that's Kinko Elusives, which I would say right now is the other kind of like dedicated to tier 1 list. So now let's go ahead and get into some of the new concepts here, because as we can see, I mean, the patch did, as much as it sort of didn't shake up the meta very much, it did herald in a couple of somewhat new concepts to the metagame that we kind of weren't quite seeing before. In particular, the best performing of which is Braum Anivia. Now this is, I just think a couple of cards off of BBG's version of Braum Anivia. This is what I'm currently running in the meta, and it's doing very, very well. This is a deck that comes in on the stats at a very impressive 60% win rate. Wow, that's pretty good. It definitely has the potential to be a tier 1 deck moving forward, but as it's a new archetype and there hasn't been time for a meta response yet, it's a little too early to, you know, put it anywhere. But it's being played quite a bit on ladder, and yeah, it's doing very well. At the end of the day, in every Runeterra meta, the thing to understand is, like, there's always going to be a Shadow Isles control deck. Basically always. In every meta, there's always going to be whatever the best deck that uses Vile Feast, Grasp, Wail, and Vengeance is just going to be one of the decks in the meta, because there's kind of like a very, very distinct niche for the idea of just like a control deck, right? Shadow Isles is kind of the only region that actually has pure control tools, and because of that, there will just always be room for Shadow Isles plus X. Depending on the meta, Shadow Isles plus X could be PNZ with Karina. It could be even Noxus. We've seen some experimentation. It could be Bilgewater. We've seen Keg Control. And even Deep, I would say, is a little bit different, but still falls under the concept of Shadow Isles plus X. And right now, this is it. Brow Manivia is currently the best performing Shadow Isles control deck, and every other Shadow Isles deck will kind of just feel kind of like a worse version of this because of that, right? Like when you compare this to Keg Control, which is kind of what we were running last week, it's gonna be basically the same thing, but slightly better matchup tables. And the same with Deep, ultimately, right? Like all of these decks, it's just coming down to what's the best way to actually use these cards. And every new patch, there will always be, you know, that question. What's the best way? So right now, the deck does very well. The idea behind the deck is very simple. You're just stalling out the opponent. You've got, you know, Braum to be a kind of nice bit of a wall. It's a pretty solid value play. You're going to be hitting like some pretty nuts Rekindler, Chronicler value. You can use Chronicler on Anivia. You can use Chronicler on Rekindler, Rezzing Anivia. Basically, the idea is your win condition is just stalling. You get a bunch of Anivias, and yeah, you basically just kind of like win the game off of that. It's fairly straightforward. Right now, I'm currently at 2 hapless. I don't think it's a meta where you really want to be in hapless. For the most part, even though it's a super fast meta, most of the aggressive decks are not actually going to be caring about hapless. There's going to be a lot of, you know, not just elusives, but also stuff like Precious Pet, stuff like Overwhelm. It's just kind of like a bad time to be like too invested in this 1/1 chump blocker right now, in my opinion, and I don't think any deck I would build would run it as a 3 of. Okay, and the next concept that is fairly new is Basilisk Writer. Now, there's a lot of different types of running Basilisk Writer, but this is my current version. I'm going to be modifying this. I actually plan on playing this deck. This is the deck that I'm going to be playing on my EU account tomorrow, actually probably today if you're watching this. On stream. Come and say hi. You know, I'm probably, if you're watching this, there's a good chance I'm live right now playing this deck on the EU ladder. And you know, we'll see actually how it ends up working out. But overall, Basilisk Writer decks come in at pretty high win rates across the board. It's a little tricky to average because there's many different versions of Basilisk Writer. Overall, the average hits around a 59% win rate. Very good as well. Very respectable. And it definitely does have the potential to hit tier 1 capabilities, although I'm personally fairly skeptical of that. The biggest thing about Basilisk Writer and what it incentivizes from a deck build, well, a lot of people are running, you know, some people are running multiple Harrowings. Most people are running Darius. I personally am not the biggest fan of Darius in the current meta. I think it ends up being too slow for pretty much all of the decks you're trying to beat down. Against a high-level opponent, you are going to be against, you know, if you're even, you know, still trying to close out the game on turn 6, you're going to be against Heimer Vi. They'll have no problem dealing with Darius and laughing about it. You're going to be against, yeah, like Braum and Nivea. You're kind of like playing into stuff like Vengeance. Whereas if you want to be beating the Heimer Vi players, then the kind of like old school, my particular favorite approach, which if you've watched me for a while, this is not the first time, that I've kind of liked the meta position of Draven Vision. Now, this obviously is kind of an overextension against some of the Shadow Isles decks, but the Harrowing does allow you to often kind of come over the top of these decks and still beat them anyway. A really big deal with the addition of Basilisk Writer and even Iron Ballista, which we haven't really seen in the past, is this idea of you constantly having an Overwhelm unit on the board. And when you're kind of like always going to be on an Overwhelm unit, a card like Decisive Maneuver gets a huge boost. Decisive Maneuver versions of Basilisk Spiders. By the way, so my version is the one running like Draven Vision. I don't know if anyone else is running this kind of concept. but I'm not the only person running Decisive Maneuver, and Decisive Maneuver on the stats is actually pretty nuts on this deck so far. Small sample size, so we really don't know, but the biggest reason for this is because you're always going to have an Overwhelm on the board that stunning whatever blocks the Overwhelm is just going to be dealing a lot of damage, right? This has kind of always been the flaw with Decisive Maneuver, which is you want to do it off of an open attack, but that makes the stun kind of useless. When you have an Overwhelm unit, when you remove its blocker from combat, you're dealing just your absolute full damage, unlike if you were to stun a blocker to a non-Overwhelm unit, you're still doing nothing, right? So Decisive Maneuver ends up making a lot of sense with these new additions to the list. Overall, we're going to experiment with this and see how it places, but these Basilisk Writers decks are pretty solidly tier 2 for the time being. Oh, and one last thing. Some people also run this concept with Freljord, Splash. That's going to be like Omenhawk, Ruthless Raider, that kind of thing. I've even seen Sejuani. Now, I don't think that's going to be as good. The stats support that as well. The stats on that deck are a few percent points less on the win rate overall, and you just have more of a reason to be in just a couple of Shadow Isles cards here. We might even be thinking about something like Atrocity as well. There's definitely a few different ways this list could be tweaked as, you know, we play it tomorrow. So this is one that if you're interested in playing this concept, you're definitely going to want to check back on the site. You know, if you want to, you can find the link in the pinned comment here. I keep the site up to date, but I can only do these videos once a week, which means that as you're watching this video, there's a very good chance that my site already has a updated version of this list, and if you want to check it out for yourself, definitely go there so you can see the updated version. Okay, next up we got Yoink Sejuani. Now, this is my current build. It looks a little strange. Let me break down how this is gonna work. Well, first, let me say Yoink Sejuani is a very weird and unsolved archetype right now. There's actually a lot of different ways of running it. In fact, this is, I think currently, in terms of the competitive meta, this is by far the most versatile deck to build. The idea of Sejuani Bilgewater can actually be built in like 4 or 5 radically different ways. Some people are building it for pure tempo. That's going to be, you know, Fury of the North. They're not running the NAB package at all. They're not running Black Market Merchant and Pilfered Goods. They're running like Fury of the North and Island Navigator, you know, that whole package. And then there's some, you know, that lean deeper into the Yoink package. There's some that are like 3 Gangplank that just play for like the full Monkey Idol plan. 3 Gangplank, 3 Monkey Idol is actually a version that has one of the higher win rates on ladder so far, and that's what this is closer to, although it is at the same time somewhat hybridized. So basically this is a slower version of Sejuani. Actually, let's talk about why Sejuani is weaker now than it was before. So about like 3 or 4 weeks ago, Sejuani was somewhat briefly a tier 1 deck. The reason why it fell off is pretty simple. The meta sped up, and Sejuani is not a deck that really wants to play that fast. It can play faster. You can go into, yeah, the Fury of the North scout package and just kind of rush your opponent down, completely cut out all the Yoink stuff. But at that point, you often might as well be running a different kind of deck, right? Like, overall, most of the value cards you're getting here benefit from, yeah, stuff like the Riptide Rex, stuff like slowing down for your Sejuani level, stuff like the Black Market Merchant combos, right? Are kind of like the highest value kind of reasons to be in this sort of archetype. And right now, this version of the deck comes in at about a 57% win rate, which is, hey, pretty good. It's not bad at all. I mean, it definitely is like, you know, potentially approaching tier 1 win rates. So yeah, it's a very solid way to play the idea of Yoink Sejuani. We're seeing a lot of decks using Monkey Idol right now. As I mentioned before, as soon as this card went to 5 health, this is kind of like no longer a meme card. It does take a somewhat specific meta and a somewhat specific deck, but we've seen like 3 or 4 different competitive decks using this card now. It's definitely like not a complete meme card anymore. Overall, this deck's goal is to just like reliably be flipping Sejuani as aggressively as possible, while just making sure we're slowing the opponent down and using tools that are going to double on that, right? Stuff like Parlay not only helps flip Sejuani, but helps beat the aggro matchups. Stuff like Prowling Cutthroat is doing the same thing, particularly relevant against the elusive version. A lot of people are playing this new Kinku Keeper of Masks deck of mine, and the Prowling Cutthroat is a great just elusive chump blocker, which is super important because sometimes it's the difference between a Green Glade duo getting through or not, which is a ton of damage. Overall, I'm actually going to mess around a bit with Sejuani as well. This is definitely on my to-do list. I do think this deck has, I will say, tier 1 potential, just because there's so many different ways to build it. We will really have to see, and I think the biggest thing for me about this deck is I'm a really big fan of less than 3 Pilfered Goods. I'm really on 2 right now. The biggest thing to understand about Black Market Merchant and Pilfered Goods is they have an extremely similar relationship to Cursed Keeper and like Ravenous Butcher, which is that one of them is the core combo piece and one of them is like the off piece. Like, double drawing Merchant is really great. Double drawing Pilfered Goods without Merchant is really actually quite terrible. You don't really want to be doing that. So as nice as it is to Merchant and Goods, right, as nice as it is, and it's similar to Keeper Butcher in that way, you really don't want to be double drawing this. So I'm personally not a really big fan of the third Pilfered Goods. To be honest, I actually think this is the reason why a lot of people don't like the nab package in this deck, is because they think it has to be with 3 Pilfered Goods, and they try it and it's really slow and clunky. But when you run 3 Merchant and then 1 or 2 Pilfered Goods, it actually feels very good, especially when you're drawing some extras off of Yordle Grifter. So overall, this is a pretty great version of the deck that I would recommend to anyone. Oh, also, I do want to point out, in terms of the champions, there's actually a sort of similar thing going on there. There's been, like, many meta decks in the past that have actually been better with, like, not the 3 and 3 champion split that you most commonly see. There's been many, many, many decks in the past that it's a bit better on the win rate stats to run, you know, a one of on one of the champions, you know, like basically like we're doing here. Instead of running 3 and 3, now you'll see versions of this deck. Usually you see 3 Misfortune, 3 Sejuani. There's another version that runs 3 Gangplank, 3 Sejuani, and I think that this kind of split is just going to be better than both. There's a lot of high synergy decks that obviously you want to be running 3 and 3 champions. Don't get me wrong, probably a majority of decks, but I do think that's kind of like a deck building mentality that people just kind of feel very locked into. When certain champions are low synergy, sorry, where am I? Okay, she got excited for a bit. Hey, it's okay. When certain champions are low synergy and exhibit kind of like high diminishing returns, like Gangplank on the double draw, it's perfectly fine to take a split like this, and usually will boost the deck's win rate. We've seen time and time again, like on the stats, there have been many cases where the splits are noticeably higher on the stats. And yeah, honestly, I do want to talk more about kind of like this sort of like some amount of deck building theory when I do these videos, because there's a lot of interesting things to dissect in terms of like how the decks evolve. Even like a few cards will really radically change sometimes the matchup tables of specific decks. Alright, now we get to Elusive Burn with the Ionia Noxus version. The Zed version of mine is, honestly, this is a weird deck. This is a deck that is big on the stats. This version is the highest version on the stats, but at the same time, I'm pretty confident that it does lack refinement. It's, as mentioned, a bizarre deck. So the biggest benefit of this deck is it feeds off of Heimer Vi, basically. Because you have burn tools, you're able to potentially just like power them down before they come online with spells, which is really important. And you'll see the same thing happening with the PNZ burn. But overall, this is a deck that does get quite a bit worse with the Kinko elusives being now again in like the high tier metagame. This current version comes in at a 60% win rate, but across all versions of the deck, average might be closer to 58 depending on how you weigh it. Overall, pretty good deck. It's not enough of like a sample size or enough of a consistency across versions for me to call it tier 1. It's a solid tier 2 deck, and it's somewhat anti-meta. It's able to break down Heimer Vi. I would say that when you compare this to the Kinko Elusives deck, it's going to have a worse win rate against most decks. It's going to have a worse win rate against most decks, the Elusive Burn one, but it will have, instead of having a negative win rate versus Heimervi, it has a positive win rate versus Heimervi. And that is a really, 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 really big deal, and enough to warrant the entire idea of going into this deck. So another concept that I do plan on experimenting a lot with. I do think that there's a lot of these tier 2 decks that, if refined, could be tier 1. For sure. Absolutely. And yeah, this is kind of like the third concept I've pointed out that I definitely plan on getting around to that. One really big thing right now, though, is that I would highly, highly recommend the Zed version of this list. I mean, okay, so let's just go ahead and look at the stats. I can actually show you what I'm talking about. So yeah, as we can see, the Zed version comes in with higher stats, 61% win rate. The others are 58, maybe 59, depending on how you round it. And yeah, the Zed version comes in higher. I would say right now, in the current metagame, Zed is a little too important because things are so fast. Basically, to put it one way, the reason you would cut Zed is because the deck is kind of built around going over the top of the opponent and sort of ignoring unit combat, right? That's the reason a lot of the versions in the past have cut Zed. And that might have been correct for a while, I'm not even sure. But for the most part, Zed really does have to be hitting these lists now, because when you're in aggro mirrors, you need the Zed. Because when you're racing down your opponent, the person with the Zed will win, period, right? And this is the biggest thing about Zed to realize, is that fundamentally, Zed is a defensive card, right? And I kind of talk about this in my Kinko Elusives guide that isn't out yet, but basically, just because it forces the opponent to block, it's defensive in a way that aggro needs to be able to beat aggro mirrors. Of course, it also has the ability to be very offensive as well, but it's just kind of like too impactful to not be running here. So yeah, it's a deck that is doing very well. I think it'll do even better with refinement, and we'll have to see if it's able to hit the metagame long term. Okay, next up we have Misfortune Aggro. There's actually a few different concepts of this going around, but this is mine, and it's actually very similar to, I think BBG was also running 2 Petty Officers, and Fresh Lobster was running, he wasn't running the Officers, but he was running a sort of similar thing. Basically, the premise here is that because Petty Officer got buffed, it's a very efficient double unit play now, right? So, in the same vein as like maybe House Spider has been in the past, it's quite nice with Bannerman. It's just a very efficient stat line. When you in this deck, you are basically always using it to summon a random 1-cost follower, and that's great. That's kind of all it needs to be doing. It's 2 bodies for Bannerman to buff, 2 bodies for Genevieve to buff. Oh, and I should mention, that's the other thing with this deck. It's basically, at this point, we've decided Genevieve is just better than Cytheria in this deck, which is impressive, man. I never thought I would see the day where Cytheria gets somewhat dethroned, but in this specific deck, not in the normal like Bannerman midrange, but in this Misfortune version, Genevieve is better than Cytheria, and that is nuts. Now this one is currently a little lower on the stats at a 54% win rate to the closest version. And overall, I think it's still a solid deck. It'll still climb you pretty fast. I actually think it's slightly underrated at that stat, 54. I expect it to actually go up to around 56 next week. If I had to guess, it'll probably get boosted a couple of percentage points. I think this version is probably slightly ahead of, you know, just a couple of card tweaks, but ends up being slightly ahead, and I do think it is being somewhat underrepresented. That being said, it's very possible that just the sheer dominance of the elusive strategies, like Kinko's starting to flood in, will just stop that from happening. And that's the biggest thing holding this deck back. Very simply, the Kinko Wayfinder deck just can't lose against this. Just like having elusives and the opponent not having elusives is just insane. The fact that this deck just can't do anything against elusives racing it down is definitely a really major Achilles heel for this deck. Okay, let's go ahead and go next. We've got Burn Aggro. Very, very standard stuff. This deck hasn't changed at all. Look at this. Last updated 5 days ago. Haven't even updated this. Not a single card has changed in this deck. It is the Burn Aggro you know and love. Actually, I'm trying to remember the stats on this. It was like high 50s. Mid to high 50s, like 56. Yeah, 56. 56% win rate on Tito. It has fallen somewhat from grace, and it has been, as I mentioned last week, dethroned by this elusive burn version, which effectively has, at this point in time, proven to just be a better version of it. Now, it's not the end of the world for Burn Aggro. It's still a solid list. It still hits tier 2 for the time being, but man, there's just not too much going on with it for the current week. Honestly, I normally kind of try to spend a little bit of time talking about these. There's really nothing to say about this. I've talked about Burn Aggro like every week for the past 6 weeks. This deck hasn't changed like at all at this point. Its win rate has gone down a bit, and that's just because there have been kind of like slightly better versions of the concept being implemented. All right. Now, let's go ahead and get into next up, Keg Control. Now, Keg Control, I'm still going to keep tier 2, but it is, as I mentioned when I talked about the Braum and Ivia, effectively going to be probably a worse version of that, unfortunately, for the time being. Coming in at like 55% win rate, pretty middling, kind of like bottom of tier 2 at this point in time. And yeah, overall, it's a deck that I could actually see myself potentially removing from this list next week. I don't know why I said last week. Yeah, as I mentioned, it cut Hapless Aristocrat for the same exact reason I mentioned before, which is just that against the aggro decks right now, Hapless isn't really even able to do its job against like most kinds of threats. Like it beats Legion Saboteur, and that's about it. But yeah, overall, it's a cute deck. It's fun to play. You know, I really like the idea of just kind of like spamming kegs with this, and it really isn't bad, but it does lack the ability to go late game against Heimer Vi, which is something that Braum and Ivia has, and most important. Tempo Endure, man, how the mighty have fallen. Getting just a couple of back-to-back nerfs have donked Tempo Endure all the way down to a 53% win rate. Overall, this deck could exist in a somewhat different form, but for the most part, I don't think that this deck is going to see, like, you know, anywhere close to tier 1 play again. You know, it's not bad. It is... I'm still going to put it on tier 2, although it is definitely hitting, like, it potentially almost... potentially almost tier 3, just because of the kind of like timings of the meta. It doesn't really end up with a lot of favorable matchups, right? A lot of things are able to actually race it down faster than it's able to play, or are just kind of going to be too good at stopping it from doing its game plan. So for the most part, this sort of like Shadow Isles aggro package of Keeper, Blighted, Caretaker, I do think is definitely not a thing of the past, but it has been, yeah, dethroned. It feels very much like a tier 2 concept right now. At this point in time, I expect a lot of people will be messing around with different ways of running it. But man, the 1 health on the Escaped Abomination is a really big deal. It's hard to explain how big of a deal that is. It definitely just makes it much less of a threat and much more counterable. And especially when you're playing for these like aggro spots, you need like every little piece of reach you can get, right? So losing that 1 health is often the difference of an extra attack, maybe 4 damage threatened, which is just insane, right? So overall, Shadow Isles is just kind of like, doesn't have what it takes to be like aggro king right now, and has been, in terms of like high tier competitive stuff, relegated to back to its kind of like control roots. I do think They Who Endure in particular isn't really an amazing card at 7 mana. This is something I was like mentioning with I was talking about it with Mogwai on the podcast, that They Who Endure just doesn't feel like a power card at 7 mana. You would think it doesn't really matter a ton, but just the way the meta has slowed down, it ends up still getting countered by pretty much everything. Will of Ionia being a really big one, even stuff like, you know, Concussive Palm hitting a couple decks. It's just a card that basically can't really be fast enough, and until the meta slows down, it's not going to be great as it was before. Next up, we've got Deep, which does actually technically maintain a tier 2 win rate, and it actually does have a 55% win rate this week. Now, the biggest reason for this is, like I was saying, Shadow Isles has been relegated to its kind of like control roots, and at the end of the day, you know, because there's so much aggro in the meta, like any Shadow Isles deck with like Grasp, Whale, Vile Feast, even some Haplesses, depending on, you know, where you're at, is going to have a decent win rate. Even Deadbloom Wanderer, which is kind of like, it's ran here as a somewhat synergy card, but the lifesteal is really good against the aggro meta. This is the biggest reason this deck's able to do well right now, is just because any Shadow Isles deck can beat off aggro. But at the end of the day, it still just does feel like a worse version of some of the other Shadow Isles decks, and I definitely can't say I recommend it over the alternatives, even though it does have a decent win rate. It's just like, these cards create sort of a go fish situation with your opponent, where it's like, when you're playing aggro, you know, the trade-off is aggro beats Heimer Vi beats Shadow Isles, and Shadow Isles beats aggro. That's kind of the meta triangle we are in right now, right? Which is pretty much exactly what you would expect when you're seeing like Heimer Vi as like a combo-y, potentially mid-range deck. You know, we can look at kind of like how the triangles would work, and yeah, control beats aggro. That's Shadow Isles beating aggro. Aggro beats combo. Heimer Vi is, you can call it either a mid-range or a combo deck. It definitely is, it does hit a few different categories at once, potentially. It's sort of hard to characterize, but that ends up beating control in this case. So yeah, overall, it is sort of what you would expect. I should have kind of mentioned that at the start. I'm kind of like literally like 40 minutes into this video probably at this point, and I'm just mentioning how like the general meta triangle works. Yeah, that's it. It's like aggro decks are beating Heimer Vi. Heimer Vi deck is beating Shadow Isles for the most part. Brahma Nivea is good because this is the one deck that can somewhat go toe-to-toe with Heimer Vi in the late game, and then the Shadow Isles decks are beating up on the aggro decks. Okay. And then lastly, you know what? I'll put it here. Poro Lux does actually have a decent win rate. Now, this is BBG's version of Poro Lux. I'm not going to lie, I haven't touched this concept. This is probably the first deck that I've shown on a tier list that I literally haven't even played. Honestly, okay. It's got a 55% win rate. It's not the worst thing ever. If you want to mess around with Poros, this is probably a good way to do it. Like, you know, obviously Aurora Borealis and Lux has a bit of a, you know, synergy here. And at the end of the day, you're often going to be winning off the back of, like, a good Radiant Guardian or a good, you know, Lux sticking to the board. So, if you do want to mess around with Poros, this is going to be one of the better ways to do it. That being said, I will have to point out, unfortunately, that you'll notice this deck isn't running Poro Snacks. It's not running the tough Poro. It's not a full Poro deck. And I think it has to be that way, guys. I'm sorry. But if you are looking for some... Hey, look, listen. 55% win rate. That ain't bad. That ain't bad, you know? It's just like, don't add the snacks. Don't press your luck. You know, it doesn't need those cards. You can just... We can have a Poro deck. We don't have to make it worse, guys. It can be alright. It can be alright. Just like this. Alright? Honestly, it is not impossible that I might mess around with some Poro concepts in the next, like, week or two. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, it's pretty low odds, because like I was saying, this is kind of like tryhard a week for me. Well, month. I have no idea how long. It's just like, well, the meta is in a state where there's not a ton of, like, super new original concepts that can be high tier. We are just gonna have fun messing around with kind of like basically just optimizing tier 1 decks and really just focusing on improving what's already good and making the best cancer decks for you guys to be able to net deck. So yeah, that's it for kind of the tier 1 and tier 2 decks this week. Ignore this visual bug. I have no idea what this shouldn't be here. I'm gonna fix that. There's like a blank line here. And as mentioned in these videos, I don't cover tier 3 decks. You know, I might like rearrange how the tier 3 decks are going, but if you wanted to try out the tier 3 decks, yeah, you'll have to check out this. You know what? Actually, I will actually put up one deck, which is Karma Ezreal. I think Karma Ezreal, I might be bumping it to tier 2 pretty soon, but for the time being, I'm gonna keep it in tier 3. I don't know if there's quite enough reason to be in Karma with Ezreal. I think Ezreal Twisted Fate might be a deck that could have a ton of potential that I will be experimenting with Ezreal Twisted Fate in the next week. That's going to be one of the decks that could actually be tier 1, not joking. Ezreal Karma, it's just going to be kind of like a worse version of Heimer Vi. It runs a lot of, well, I say worse version. They play very, very differently, but it does run a lot of the same cards, and if you are running these cards, you'd rather be in Heimer Vi. This is Oneric's version of Karma Ezreal, and it's probably the best thing right now if you are looking for a Karma Ezreal deck. as I mentioned, this is one of the examples of where you do want a 3-2-1 champion split. You don't want a 3-3 champion split. 3-2-1 is perfectly fine here. You really don't need that third karma, and the 1 Vi really helps a lot of like kind of like mid-game positions. I'm a big fan of a lot of the ratioing here. You know, the 2 claws of the dragon. You don't really want to be hyperbicked on the third one. 1 health push and 1 get excited for kind of like the finisher. And I do like Concussive Palm in the current meta as well. That's why it found its way into our elusive deck. Anyway, that's it. That is the Meta Mondays. I am going to be making a lot of videos about like guides to these tier 1 decks. Like I said, it's the month of Tryhard Swim, and that means not only are we making tier 1 decks, but we're going to be making guides for tier 1 decks. So I'll be playing Basilisk, I'll be playing Elusive Burn, I'll be playing probably Twisted Fate Ezreal, and there was a 4th deck there that I forgot. I'm not sure what the 4th deck was, but I'll be refining a 4th deck as well, all in the next week or week and a half. Hopefully, at least one of those decks will be able to join something in tier 1, and try to like spur on a little bit of diversity into the meta, although Browmanivia actually has a pretty decent chance of that. So we really will have to see how everything shapes up. You know, it's anyone's bet, but for the most part, it is a fairly consolidated meta. I do think that the meta is probably somewhat unhealthily fast right now. It is limiting a decent amount of potential strategies in the game. Now, obviously, every time you might mention that it's like too fast of a meta, I always hear a lot of people say, well, if it's not aggro dominating, then it's control dominating, so pick your poison. And that's not really true. I don't know why I hear that so much, actually. It is actually very possible to have more balanced metas. Actually, it happens all the time. Right now, yeah, I mean, the meta is more aggressive than would be kind of like ideal for the diversity of the ladder environment in that way. And I'm sure it'll slow down a little bit, depending on exactly what they do with the next patch and the next batch of cards that they're going to be dropping on us. Because I do think that's, man, I should really check my facts. But I think that's the next thing we're getting, which is a bundle of cards. Because they mentioned that they're going to do expansions every 6 months and then a new bunch of cards. We have no idea how many, every 2 months or something like that. So I'm very interested to see how that might affect the metagame. We'll have to see. All right, but yeah, that's it for me. That's all I got. And yeah, look out for the Kinko Elusives very thorough deck guide tomorrow. I'm actually putting a lot of effort into this. I think it'll help a lot of you guys. Even if you don't play Kinko Elusives, it'll actually help a lot of you guys play the game. I promise. It's gonna be a very, very, very informative video. All right. Anyway, yeah, that's it. That's all I got. Bye, guys.